Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our next episode of the Industrial Insights Podcast. I have Ryan Robinson of American Eagle Solutions with me today, and he came by way of Todd Spencer in our Columbus office. And anybody who's been in the game for a long time, especially who knows Lee, knows Todd. Todd is fantastic and a partner we've worked with a bunch of times, and excited to learn more about what Ryan's doing as he has a firm that's focused on electrical stand-ups and lighting upgrades, but is also part of the Prologis Essentials platform and has been scaling with partners across the country. So a huge resource and knowledge base of experience working with big corporates and working with Prologis. So Ryan, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, Justin, thanks for having me. I'm excited to dig in.
Yes, power is a big deal. I got to be on a panel for NAOP on their Icon West, and it was all about running out of power, the state of the power grids, and got into policy a little bit. I was the person speaking about what tenants need and companies and manufacturers and what they're looking for and how it lines or misaligns with what's available in the marketplace today for buildings that have already been built. So that was a fun panel to be on, and it connected with me with a lot of people that you might be familiar with that are working on a lot of great and large projects. So, yeah, that was just another experience to just collaborate and make sure that we're all elevating the experience that we're providing with clients. So, AES and Ryan, maybe give us the download on where you came from so people can get to know you a little better as we open up the topic.
For sure. First and foremost, thanks again for having me on. I've listened to a bunch of episodes for you. I actually listened to yesterday. The episode, I wrote it down, the electrifying industrial property, I think with John Daglio. Super interesting. I love the way he kind of explained with the coffee maker analysis, right? And there's only so much water behind the dam, right? So really, really interesting stuff. But in terms of kind of who AES, what we've done, right? AES is a national electrical services contractor. We're headquartered in Northeastern PA. I myself am down in Carolinas, down in Charleston, but we've got, a team throughout the country. You
No
know what?
hurricane out there. I don't see it.
No,
Yeah, that's okay.
we're good. We're good. We dodged that bullet. So at least this time around. So all good there. But AES is really from an origin standpoint, we really started as a lighting retrofit company back in 2018. I'm one of the founding members of the company, and really we came from the core group of executives came from the ESCO world, right? So really focusing on energy efficiency upgrades for industrial spaces, municipalities, things like that. But what AES is always focused on very heavily is really lighting projects, lighting upgrades, lighting retrofits, right within the industrial warehousing space. And so that's really how we started. What we've evolved into is we've been fortunate enough to be able to kind of follow the demand of our customers, and that's allowed us to really evolve into a full electrical services contractor, right, with a very, very heavy focus on, what I term, electrical stand-ups, or either a new development for a warehouse or, a new customer moving in. There's a lot of electrical infrastructure in place, but that orientation of that building, right? So the amount of racking, the automation, the amount of material handling equipment, the amount of power just in general that they're going to need really dictates the scope. So that's what we've been focused on, and that's really allowed us to gain some really strong partnerships, right? So we are really part of the Essentials, the Prologis Essentials team with those guys. They're unbelievable. The program, specifically on the lighting side, has been, kind of game changing within the industry. We've done, as a whole, roughly about 500 million square feet within the Essentials program alone of lighting upgrades. So it's been successful, longstanding, and it's really helped us grow and kind of follow where they need us to be as well.
Yeah. It's funny, lighting. Like, you don't
Hmm.
know until you know that that's a big thing. And like, you
Yeah.
can't get through the city without having it in the right place. And there was the utilities that used to pay for upgrades as they were pushing LED a decade ago. And then now everybody's needs are a little different if you're an e-com facility or you're a manufacturing facility of what you might need. For lighting today, what's the general like a state of the nation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that as far as what I'll call fluorescent to LED technology, the market's pretty mature in the industrial warehouse space where I guess in the simplest terms, there's more LED than there's not at this point in time. There are still some pretty significant rebate programs that are out there. New Jersey, Baltimore, Atlanta, they've all got, decent programs within those, and there's many others as well. But I would say that really we're still busy, right? The work and the opportunities are still coming. There's enough non-fluorescent out there, right? That it definitely, I would say, justifies focus, right, from an industrial warehouse standpoint. And
Halogen domes that
yeah,
buzz, that take a while to warm up, that kind of stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
those I haven't seen those in a while. I will say that. But thankfully, those are pretty much out of the space. Where it's going, right? At the end of the day, LED is an electrical component, and over time, obviously, electrical components fail, right? There's a generation one LED, right, wave that we feel is coming right within the next couple of years, where you're going to see a pretty large demand for LED to LED replacement, really going in as the Gen 1 LEDs fail, doing a full another turnkey upgrade for those customers. The old generation was really driven off of energy savings. I think this next wave, in my opinion, is going to be more heavily focused on yes, some savings, but also avoided maintenance, right? And the safety component of that. A failed fixture is a failed fixture, right? It doesn't matter really how much you're saving, right? The space has to be well lit. So I think those times are coming, right? It's kind of like I could see the wave off in the distance, right? It's not here, right? But the day is coming, right, where we're going to be doing a pretty significant amount of LED to LED replacement.
Yeah, I could totally see how a lot of the in-place lighting is generally pretty modern because we had the push of new construction at like 2023 and so many larger size facilities being built, all with the modern lights. And that just by virtue of the buildings being larger, like it started to dwarf the existing inventory just by like square foot. What would you say is like the general amount of time that the Gen 1 lights are reliable for until like, is that like a 5 years and it's usually like the motion sensor or it's 10 years? And like, yeah, what would you say is like marks the start of the problems per se?
Yeah, I would say the data that we're seeing right now is kind of pointing to that failure anytime between with an installation at any time from 2015 to 2017 right now, right? So, in the past month, we've probably had 10 to 15 conversations with customers that are starting to see that failure, right? Where 15 to 20% of their lights are already out, and they're starting to feel that pain. I would say that between that 10 and 7 years ago time frame, right, is where I'm seeing it in the industrial warehouse space, right? I would say that manufacturing could be a little bit different, right? Especially if you've got high heat environments, things like that, right? But it as a whole, it's starting to get to that point, right? It's not quite there yet. Drivers are going to start failing, LED chips are going to start failing, especially in higher heat areas. So what we're kind of focused on with ourselves and then also with Essentials is trying to start to get out ahead of that for our customers and make sure that they see us as a resource and really together a plan that's more effective than a reactive maintenance program, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And imagine it doesn't have to be tied to a contract renewal. That's when we brokers are usually involved. Like
Sure.
this would generally be tied to making sure you're staying ahead of problems, right? And just have like a best practice maintenance and CapEx schedule. But I surely know that when we do renewals, it's often a trigger for certain capital expenses and upgrades where we are willing to commit and invest for the next 5, 7, or 10 years if X, Y, and Z happen at such and such rate, and that can oftentimes be part of the like a total package of doing a new deal.
Yeah, totally. I think we're starting to see that more and more where the landlord needs to be a little bit more cognizant of when the LED fixtures were installed, right, as part of a renewal or TI budget, because not all LED is created equal, right? At the end of the day,
We
like
don't
we
ask
talked
that
about.
question until today. That is, how old's
Yeah.
the roof? How old's the air conditioning units? Like, that's not something that is usually on our radar.
Yeah, I've seen it enough times where, space is marketed as LED, right? And that in a lot of ways, at least from a customer perspective, can be viewed as I don't have to touch this, right? This is a done deal, right? My
100%. Yeah.
space is good. But, when reality kicks in, right? And, 20 to 30% of those fixtures have failed, or the lighting doesn't align, right, with a VNA racking system, for example, right? And they need to add 30% more fixtures to the space just to properly light it.
Yeah.
Those are kind of worth pointing out, and that's what we focus on, right? Is how do we work with customers, right, that are coming into a new facility to understand the conditions versus what their operations is going to be. So, you had Parth Tommy on. He's awesome. Heavy on the essentials team for the automation side. We work with the essentials racking team, pretty frequently, other racking vendors across the country, to where we're working hand in hand with them, and sitting down with the customer saying, hey, this is the design that you have from an operational standpoint, right? VNA racking, whatever, 35 forklift chargers, X amount of conveyor, right, et cetera, right? Here's how we need to get out ahead of this from an electrical standpoint to make sure that you're supported and to make sure that you're not blindsided when these measures come into place, right? And really not blindsided by timelines, such as a permit, right? So that's kind of our focus within the industry.
I am feeling this pain today, and I'm about 10 days into it on a project that I'm working on. So I feel
Okay.
like, and you're reminding me about it, which is this. Gosh, when you go into the facility and you see that it has all the lighting set up, and then like you are in the start of your space planning. As a broker, I'm not always intimately on the forefront of the client's space planning and all the internal conversations with all of the racking and design people, but oftentimes like I'm around the hoop. Sometimes I'm involved with certain clients, sometimes I'm not. And so it is interesting to think of when you're walking a building and you're looking up and you are speaking with your client from my perspective of, hey, let's make sure that our material handling partner sees the current lighting setup and can at least help us understand what changes we're going to need, knowing the last guy didn't have a VNA setup, a very narrow aisle for those not knowing, or rather they had it oriented in a different way for a different product, for different dimensions and different equipment. The example that I'm working on right now, the whips were too short, so when it was time to move the lights, they couldn't be moved with the whips that were on hand. And so who's gonna pay for making the whips 5 times longer? And that's not the landlord, where maybe it would have been the landlord if we were aware of it on day one and that was all baked into it. And so it is the tough part of baking a deal. And how much information do you have when you're baking a deal versus due diligence and feasibility, and what do you find out after you've baked a deal and then you're working and you're at the city and the city says yes or no, or the material handling person says yes or no, or the landlord says yes or no in terms of, are the lighting okay where they are? Do you have to make these changes, and so on and so forth. So that's one that we are working on right now with a client on a couple 100,000 feet, and it adds up. And like it is
Yes.
a very real concern that like there's a million details, and so who must know that one to do a good job? And the client does, and the broker does, and the landlord does, and the all the vendors and the team does. So that is one that I know from experience. And then it's just interesting to, okay, incorporate that into the future. But what do you do about that problem today? And like, how do you face it as best you can? And that one's an interesting one in that
Yeah, I would.
there's some room between the top of the racking and the lighting, and it seems like not best practice to leave them how they are to try and get away from having to upgrade and relocate. And who's okay with that? And if the operator's okay with that, is the city, is the landlord. And yeah, that's we're in the middle of. So not that like I'm
Yeah.
asking for help on this one in this project, but like just having lived it, like I'm perhaps more cognizant of it than I would have if had we talked last year about this.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of interesting points there, right? And it's, lighting, right, sometimes can be taken for granted, right, during that process. But when you get down to it, there's actually a ton of details to it. So what we try to do is we try to be a resource for all parties, right, and try to get out ahead of these projects as much as possible. Put together rough order of magnitude. One of the larger 3PLs that AES works with, they'll actually have us walk potential sites, right, multiple potential sites within an area, and put together rough order of magnitude pricing for the entire electrical scope, right?
Okay.
How that takes into account for lighting, just to kind of tie into your pain point right now, is we're going to document these things have 5 foot whips, right? They're general distribution fixtures, and if you were to put in VNA racking, right, you would likely have to add 35 to 40%, or all the whips would need to be replaced, or the entire system is modular
Very
wiring.
narrow aisles means more aisles, which means more lighting.
Exactly. I mean, I guess the best way that I describe it is you're essentially putting up walls, right? From a lighting perspective, right? So you're going to need to add lighting, right? Typically, unless the existing space also had VNA layout. So, right, there's a lot of components that we try to get out ahead of, right? So that all parties are kind of aware, right? So if we're working with a broker like yourself, we're going to give you that information. You can kind of do what you would with that, to help understand the total impact of the deal and the operation based upon the existing conditions.
Yeah. And material handling folks, I got to imagine when they're in there, that's something they look up and they're aware of. But like to the extent, how often is it their responsibility to call in the lighting side of things? Or are they cognizant of it? Or it's the client or the landlord or the broker or whoever? That is good to know. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think our partnerships on that side of things, right, with material handling equipment companies and things like that, is we want to take the work off of them, especially from an egress standpoint. So all these different jurisdictions have differing or varying egress codes, right? Do you need an exit sign at the end of every aisle and in the tunnels, right? California, yeah. So California, generally, yes, right? Other parts of the country, a little bit less stringent from a code perspective, but our job is to understand what the code requirements are for that particular jurisdiction and help them with that design to make sure that they're not going to get, F right on the inspection, and they can actually utilize the system that they're installing.
Yes. How often is the landlord a part of this conversation of what we should do as opposed to the operator or like the 3PL as an example?
Yeah, I would say a good amount. Really take that with a grain of salt. I think everyone differs, right? But when we work with the developer for a lot, for example, regardless of essentials, they're heavily involved, they're heavily engaged because they really, really care about that white glove service and to make sure that everything is done right. Right.
Totally.
So I find it very refreshing when the landlord wants to be heavily involved because it helps us, one, gather information, right? Understand the history of the building a little bit better, and then work, like I said, work proactively on existing conditions versus what's the goal of when this customer wants to be in and what is that operation going to look like, right? So I love when landlords are involved. I think it makes the project 20% faster easily, but it's not always the case.
Yeah. They should have the most reps of anybody in that conversation in terms of
For sure.
like playing that game and having learned and evolved and be like a sophisticated as a result.
Mhm.
Any rules of thumb or just like a general, like a things that are helpful for people to know of like a certain amount of lights per square foot or like candles for a certain like height buildings or just general costs or what would be like some good ones if people are just sizing things up and trying to like learn some of the basics.
Yeah. There's a couple good rules of thumb from a lighting density perspective. right? So generally, if you're looking to hit like it in a warehouse standard, I would say the most common foot candle that we're designing to is 15 to 20 in racking, and then 25 to 30 in open areas, dock areas, things like that. We can usually hit of what I would call a 1-to-1 ratio of mounting height of the fixture versus spacing of the fixture, right? So if you've got a 30-foot ceiling and you space the fixtures out 30 feet apart, that can give you a pretty good understanding of the amount of fixtures that you're going to need, obviously depending on the number of rack aisleways that you have, but that can give you a really good starting point, at least from a budgeting standpoint of, hey, how many fixtures am I going to need in this building? Right? You're safe with that number from our perspective, right? So the other really good rule of thumb is when you have a rack dial way, utilize the right optics, right? If possible. You know, LED fixtures, different optics. So there's like a general distribution optic, which, you know, is meant for a dock area. You know, you spread that light better.
Optic is a synonym for bulb?
So yeah, good question, right? Fixtures are really in an integrated full fixture, right? Where the LED chips, the boards are mounted directly in the fixture. So there's no real LED tubes, right? And any high quality LED high bay, right? So the optic is basically the angle that the light is going to be punched out at, right? So if you have a 6-foot aisleway and a VNA rack, there's narrow optics that help punch the light down, right? And make sure that you're not wasting 60% of the light on top of the pallet, right? And you're getting 5-foot candles in the aisleway. So
And a
that
hole in your palette.
exactly, that would be my only other kind of suggestion or rule of thumb is, you know, always keep that in mind. It makes a huge difference from a light level standpoint, from a safety standpoint.
Love it. Love the nuance there that you wouldn't know until you are a practitioner.
For better or
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah. Speaking of punching in the right direction, can we open up the aperture to more electrical infrastructure? So, if,
Yeah, I would love to.
yeah, shine a light on that if you would. Like, I would imagine a demand has changed a little bit. So, demand being like tenants' requirements and their needs. And maybe some of that change is the whole automation or robotics. Of course, there's a conveyance in like e-com and then advanced manufacturing. Hopefully, we're making more chips in the States soon. I'm sure that needs a ton of power. And then like redundancy and like the need for backup systems. So you're in all that space, or like how would you categorize demand and what it has been over the past couple of years and what you think it might look like?
I, I mean, AES's president, CEO, Tony Akernes, has kind of set a culture for us to make sure that we're following the demand of our customers, right, within our core competencies, right? So we've evolved from a lighting company to a full electrical services contractor, right? And really that is a direct result of customer demand, right? That ties it actually the origin story behind that is, you know, we're doing a lighting project, but there's a significant amount of other electrical requirements for the space. Problem is you can only have one open permit, right, at a time, right, on the electrical side of things. So, you know, years ago that cut us out of that project. So we evolved, we grew, right? We grew our
We got to
team.
get in that project. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Right now we are in this project. So the demand is, which I'm sure nobody's going to be surprised at this, right? But the electrical demand is growing rapidly, right? Especially in the industrial space. You know, in terms of advanced automation, right? Like you said, you know, material handling equipment, electrification of both forklifts and fleet vehicles. You know, all of these things, right? Power upgrades are more and more prevalent, right? And you know, we have a pretty significant amount of non-lighting electrical work that help drive the value that we provide to the customer. So our job, you know, from our perspective and probably most perspective is we need to understand really what that timeline is from a go live date. And there needs to be a pretty concise work backwards plan, right? And what that boils down to most time is by when do we need to have the permit approved to have this installed by the projected go live date? right? So we're more focused, obviously the blocking and tackling is the actual scope, the measures, but from my perspective, I am way more focused on making sure that we're proactively working with developers, brokers, customers, right? And making sure that everybody's on the same page for what the operation is going to look like, because electrical is dependent on the layout, right? And the layout is dependent on electrical. So they need to kind of work hand in hand, right, in order to meet these deadlines, because sometimes that long pole in the tent can be the electrical side of things tied to a permit.
Yes. And that was very pronounced when we were short on equipment and backlogs and everything. As that generally got
Yeah, I think it's definitely
like
gotten.
switchgear was 52 weeks, right? And like the utilities were backed up.
Yeah, I think it's definitely gotten better. I think from my perspective, it's somewhere in that 30 to 40 week range. There's some folks on my team that would definitely know better in terms of those exact time frames. Um, a lot of times 30 to 40 weeks is still way too long for customers, right? Especially if
Almost
there's not
always.
a proactive effort, right? So, you're talking 6 months plus, right, from a lead time. That's still a major problem. So we got better for sure. So we're also kind of focused on the next evolution of AS and kind of helping source that heavy electrical equipment, providing some different options and helping really act as both, the installing contractor, but also sometimes the agency and distribution partner, right, to help source this equipment, ensure that it gets to the site fast.
Yeah. Do you have any project in mind or anyone that's a good example of in the recent memory that you worked on that is a good example of like the all-encompassing effort for standing up a building for a client?
Yeah. So there's a large 3PL, I would say one of the top tier 3PLs, that we work with pretty consistently. We've done probably 10 to 12 million square feet with them in the past 18 months of warehouse stand up. So just some examples of that are, it starts with a rough order of magnitude analysis, right, of multiple sites, right? We're walking, we're analyzing drawings, and we're going out in, a specific area where they're looking at sites to compete for that business on. And we're helping them develop that electrical scope per site so that they understand what that looks like and they can make their proposal and their budget tighter. From there, that building is selected and we're immediately working and under contract with that 3PL and pulling the permit as quickly as we possibly can. We're working hand in hand with these, talking with them, understanding the total timeline, the total layout of the facility. And
Imagine you're with like the systems integrators and
yep,
conveyance, if to the extent that's a e-com related or like a conveyance related or automation related.
yeah, 100%. I mean, there's areas with hazmat areas, right? Wash down rooms, VNA racking, significant amount of forklift charging. Obviously, lighting is needed everywhere, right? But anything from the switch gear to a backup generator down to a power drop or a workstation and ability, right, falls under that scope of work and in our purview. Our job is to understand that, and that's what we've been thankfully successful in building a long-standing relationship with this customer to where the entire electrical scope is handled as proactively as possible. And the electrical, which was the longest pole in the tent, is no longer really holding anything up from a go live date. So hopefully that answers your question. It's not necessarily one specific project, but it's more of a portfolio-wide partnership that we've been able to develop.
BPLs are 50% of all the growth in the space.
Yeah.
So making sure that any rollout really is like attentive to those needs and like being able to help 3PLs get up and running like quickly and like professionally, I feel like is huge because they oftentimes are on shorter timelines and they have like the reason they're brought in is because they can like get to utilizing their platform for customers like right away. So I've never really found a 3PL that's got a need way out there in the far future. It's like, hey, we got a contract to grow now and let's get it.
It's been fun to work with 3PLs and especially ones that are really starting to dive headfirst into the automation game.
Hmm.
So it's pretty cool to kind of be that electrical support arm of their automation because frankly, we get to learn a lot and it's really interesting stuff.
Yes.
There was one we were talking about the other day that's putting in, mobile racking right within their space. And, our job is to develop the scope for the electrical infrastructure to set that up. I don't know much more about the racking system other than, right, it's just that, right? It's a sliding scale, but what a cool technology to be involved in.
Yeah, I was fortunate to interview one of the CFOs for XPO and GXO, and the amount of capital they're putting into that side of the business is like insane. Like that's their specialty, and like getting ahead of that and being like the leader in that space, and then like seeing the benefits of having made those investments and learned from making those investments and operating, and it's exciting to see that be more prevalent.
Totally.
I gotta admit, I bet you got a kick out of the John Gaglio interview of asking people to put their load summaries together, and that like you have to have that. And I know every time I go to clients and ask that, they're like, "It takes time. We don't have it. What we think we need, we know we need, and like, don't worry about it." And that's a funny one that I've noticed that once I learned from him and asked people about it, like there's a oftentimes like a mismatch between what people think they need and what they actually do. I also get manufacturing might be a little different in a load summary than like lighting, perhaps, and like more like 3PL oriented is perhaps more getting the details right than it is like the quantity of power is probably maybe less as important. But maybe with
Yeah.
warehouse automation, not so in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's my kind of John's interview, your Hart's interview with you, right? Like where we're going, right? It's, at some point, right? We're going to get to that dark warehouse space, right? Down in the distant future where it's 100% automated, right? The lights may not be, but there's a significant electrical demand that still goes with that. And then combining that with John's point, it's really cool to kind of listen to the way that he describes it. I love the coffee. And I also appreciated, utilities are painted as very, very difficult to work with, but data in, data out, right? The more information that we can give them proactively with, existing conditions and what's to come, right? The faster that we can kind of get these permits pushed through. And so I would mirror that sentiment very, very closely.
Yeah. Love it. Any rules of thumb you can think of? I know like a stand-ups and that's a broad brushstroke of electrical needs to have like a rules of thumb for, but anything of like timing or for any specific component that you can think of? I gotta imagine the working back and timing is we are always preaching to the choir of like start early and like have like a sufficient contingency for any like surprises or backlogs with the cities and like know their timelines in advance. Anything else that comes to mind that you think is helpful?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things, right? It's without sounding too cliche, right? It's never too early, right, to start understanding what the electrical requirement's going to be, right? That's kind of the reason that we are putting together rough order of magnitudes for these large partnerships, right? So they can understand obviously the cost, but more importantly, the timeline. The timeline can get away from you so fast, right?
If you don't have it, you're not operational and it doesn't matter what it costs because you can't serve your customer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? So is it, what's more expensive, a little bit more proactive approach, right, from an electrical standpoint or missing 2 months of operation, right, from a warehouse standpoint. So it's never too early. And that what we found success with is a true work backwards plan, right? I think that gives you that timeline to understand it. There's a lot of different directions you could go in from an electrical infrastructure standpoint, but as simple as it sounds, that's kind of been our recipe for success, right? And, really, really lean on the folks that understand how to work with the utility and don't take those folks for granted because it's, like we said, data in, data out, right? From a utility standpoint. And, um, there's a lot of really high level people in the electrical industry that understand kind of how to play that game and understand what they're looking for. So that's super valuable.
Yeah, yeah, with increasing every day. We've made it a long way. I'm sensitive to the time we have left. The future, what we're excited about, new frontiers where there's new energy and new demand. You had mentioned getting into heavy power a little bit as one thing that's on the frontier. What are a couple things that are on your mind as we're looking forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that as we follow demand, right, with our customers is one of our key components, right, for AES's culture, right. You know, we're actually that next evolution for AES is really around a advanced distribution model of heavy electrical equipment. Right. So, if we're talking about transformers, switch gears, right, understanding what those lead times are, um, and even working with, foreign-based manufacturers to help on the importing side of things, but also really make sure that that QA/QC process is rock solid. So we're talking about a transformer, getting it to the port, and then getting it to the port to make sure that it's installed properly, working with the right logistics company, the right QA/QC testing companies, right? Making sure that the digital gas analysis centers, right? DGA, right? Those are US based, right? To kind of eliminate any kind of fear there. So that's definitely on the horizon for AES. Kind of the advantages that we've seen is accelerated deployment, right? And with the proper turnkey partner, right, is what we're going to be of taking all accountability for the entire success of the deployment, right? It can be a very feasible model to kind of help shrink that
Like a more
timeline.
vertically oriented.
Exactly. Laser focused on that, right? So that's the, I guess, today and really future from a focus standpoint for AES.
Do you know where we make them now? That's part of the problem is we don't have enough. We haven't for a long time, and like a demand is increasing. Do you know a whole lot about like where they're made in general and like uh,
Hmm.
both now and in the future? Other than we need to make more in Columbus and Pennsylvania.
Yeah. No, for sure. We do. But I would say that definitely some US based manufacturers, a lot of the componentry, regardless, is still coming from Asia. So I think that the demand is just so high, right, with this data center push, and it's not really going anywhere. So I think the other thing that John said on the previous is right, it is first come, first serve. Having that equipment more readily available and getting it in with a very, very concise process, right, is going to speed up those utility approvals and the go live date, right, for these substations. So hopefully it's not too much of a long-winded answer, but that's kind of where we're focused.
Yeah, I love it. I love the concept of being more vertically integrated and owning the entire life cycle, because then clients can depend on you to deliver, right? And that's something that you can like is obviously of the utmost importance, and another way that you can make sure that you can provide that for them. Yeah. Ryan, this is great. I appreciate you taking the time today, and look forward to catching up with you later and trying to get some projects going. Now I know who to call.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate it, Justin. Great to meet you finally on the podcast. Thank you again for having me on. Hopefully we'll do it again someday.
Super. Talk to you
All
later.
right. Thanks.
Yep.